All right, guys, welcome back. Today we are going to be talking about immigration, political machines, and government corruption in general. So, after the Civil War, there is a rise of what's called new wave immigration. So, this is going to be immigration that happens in the later part of the 19th century or 1800s. And it is in contrast to what was called old wave immigration that happened before the Civil War. So, these newer immigrants that are coming to America are coming from places from mostly South and East Europe. So, places like Italy or Poland or Russia, Bulgaria. I mean, there's a whole bunch of other countries, Hungary, that kind of thing. And then also coming from Asia. The two biggest nationalities would have been Chinese and Japanese. Now, this is in contrast to, like I said, the old wave immigration that was mostly consisting of like Western European immigrants, like Irish, German, French, English, that kind of thing. So these newer immigrants are very diverse from the old immigrants, as well as they're very diverse from each other. They also have different appearances, skin tones, facial structure, that kind of thing. And they also have very little experience with democratic institutions. And so, for all these reasons, these newer immigrants are going to face a lot of discrimination in the United States. And they're also going to be exploited by political machines that we'll talk about later, basically corrupt governments, because of their little experience with democracy, and also because they are being discriminated against. They don't have many opportunities for housing and jobs and that kind of thing. And so these corrupt politicians are going to take advantage of that and exploit their votes for giving them basic human necessities like housing and food and things like that. Here are some images of some new wave immigrants coming in through these two immigration sites. The immigrants coming from Europe came in through Ellis Island, which was in New York City. And the immigrants that were coming in from Asia are coming to California through a immigration center called Angel Island. And both of these centers are run by the government. So, I mean, imagine like the DMV, but a lot longer, and no one speaks the language that you speak. So you can imagine it was a pretty stressful and very confusing situation for many of these immigrants that were arriving. These are pictures of Ellis Island, and these are pictures of Angel Island. You can see the long lines here. Also, you can see that immigrants were subject to physical examinations, looking for anything from, odd birthmarks, or could be signs of any communicable diseases that they could be bringing in. Sometimes they were sent back to their home country, or they were quarantined for a period of time if those were found. And you can also see here the different types of dress that these immigrants are arriving in, and these different customs and traditions and ways of dress, or just the way that they look, or their skin tone, or anything like that, are going to be reasons for discrimination in the United States. So, what are some of the consequences of new wave immigration? Well, there is a new wave of nativism, which, if you remember from American One, this is basically favoring native born citizens over foreigners or immigrants. And this was nothing new during this time period. Nativism had existed in the United States as long as the United States had existed, and it still exists today. And it kind of fluctuates, it goes up and down depending on who's in charge of the government or what worldly events are going on. But in the late 19th century, there was a huge wave of nativism because there was a large spike in immigration. And so you see some backlash against these immigrants in the form of the Americanization movement, which was this kind of social and political movement to try to pass laws and institute social norms that would limit immigration, but also kind of require immigrants to assimilate to American culture and values while leaving behind their uh, cultures and values from their home country. We also see some legislation that was passed that was designed to limit immigration of specific groups. The Chinese Exclusion Act was directed specifically at unskilled Chinese workers. They were the first and only ethnicity to be limited in the late 19th century. We'll talk more about immigration in the 20th century, where basically every country is going to face some type of quota, but in the 1800s, the Chinese were really the only group of people that were seen as so, unfavorable that they had to be limited, or essentially banned from entering the country. And that Chinese Exclusion Act isn't lifted until I think it's after World War II. And then there's the Gentleman's Agreement. This was an agreement between the US government and Japan to limit Japanese immigration, not totally ban it, but just limit it. So you can see there is some legislation that is discriminatory towards immigrants entering the United States. There was also a very important Supreme Court case that affirmed birthright citizenship for children of immigrants. There was a man, Wong Kim Ark, right here, and he was born in America to Chinese immigrants. And his family went back to China. He stayed in the United States, but he wanted to go visit his Chinese family. And so he left to go to China and then came back and tried to enter the United States. And he was told, because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, that he was not allowed to re enter. And he said, "No, I was born in the United States. I'm a citizen. Let me enter." And what the government told him was, "No, the 14th Amendment does not guarantee you citizenship because the 14th Amendment was only designed for former slaves. It is not applied to immigrants." And so he sued, and eventually it found its way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court officially said that yes, all children of immigrants born in the United States are, in fact, citizens, that the 14th Amendment applied to them as well. And so that's what we call birthright citizenship. You are a citizen if you are born on United States soil. We also see the growth of ethnic communities. Um, Basically, in these larger cities, remember we talked about urbanization a few days ago. In these larger cities, immigrants are usually looking for work. They're not typically going to go out into rural areas. They're going to stay mostly in cities looking for factory jobs or things like that. And for several different reasons, they're kind of pushed into these communities with people that are similar to them in ethnicity and language and culture and that kind of thing. And that's one because there weren't opportunities available for them to live in other places. Sometimes they were literally banned from living in certain areas of town. But other reasons why they kind of gravitated together is because they, could find some normalcy or some comfort, or people who spoke the same language. It was kind of like a lifeline for these new immigrants as well. However, corrupt political machines, which we'll talk about in a second, would exploit immigrants for votes. Um, they kind of used their lack of knowledge about, American culture and democracy, and even their lack of English literacy, and their need for jobs to basically manipulate them into voting for corrupt politicians who would essentially, in the end, just keep them in poverty for, generation after generation. You can see here these immigrants that are being essentially intimidated and right here too, intimidated into voting for corrupt politicians. So let's talk about these political machines. A political machine is essentially an organized criminal group that controls politics in a city. Every large American city in the 19th century was ruled by political machines. At the head of the political machine would be a city boss, and then there would be these corrupt politicians as well as other people in on the political machine. They all played a part to kind of keep this machine benefiting the politicians and the criminals involved. But a lot of this required that there were corrupt politicians that would make laws and award government contracts to these, corrupt um, political machine um, members in the city. And so these corrupt politicians would use what's called graft, which is basically using your political power for financial gain, which is illegal. And we'll look at an example of that in just a second. But they would also rig elections. They would encourage voter fraud, having people vote multiple times or having them vote underneath dead people's names. So you would have an election that had, two, three, sometimes four times the amount of votes than people who actually lived in that area. But they would help immigrants or the poor get jobs, find housing, that kind of thing, as long as their votes remained loyal to the political machine. So it's not, to say like, oh, these political machines are great because they helped immigrants. No, they were exploiting immigrants and keeping them in poverty and manipulating them for their vote to keep these corrupt politicians in power. The most famous political machine of this time was the New York City machine. It was known as Tammany Hall. Now, the leader of Tammany Hall was William Tweed, also known as Boss Tweed, and the corrupt politicians that controlled New York City politics were known as the Tweed Ring. And there's an image of Boss Tweed right here. He has a very um, memorable face and body. And so we're going to see him in some cartoons in a minute, and you can immediately tell who Boss Tweed is in these cartoons. But here's a prime example of graft. So basically, Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed influenced the New York City government to charge taxpayers in New York City $13 million to build the New York City County Courthouse, which is right here. It still exists today. But the construction of this courthouse only cost $3 million. So Tammany Hall, Boss Tweed, and his Tweed Ring pocketed $10 million. So here's why it's important for them to keep their power so they can keep making all of that money. So there was a muckraker named Thomas Nast. He was a cartoonist who used his cartoons to expose Tammany Hall, Boss Tweed, and what they were doing to be corrupt and to harm the citizens in New York. And he used cartoons specifically because there were many poor um, Americans and immigrants who couldn't read. Their literacy level was very low. And so writing, books or long essays about political corruption wasn't really going to be very productive. So he used cartoons and, the symbolism and illustrations in his cartoons to get across the point that Boss Tweed was a bad guy. So here are some cartoons here. I won't go too deep into them, but you can definitely tell. I mean, that's Boss Tweed. There he is too, being above the law, having, money on his mind, having his thumb on New York City, kind of saying he controls it. So there were definitely a lot of cartoons that exposed the negative side. And eventually he was convicted of fraud and jailed. But Thomas Nast and his cartoons really did eventually encourage more people to speak out publicly against government corruption, and we'll look at that in a few units in the 20th century. But this is on the local level, so let's look at political corruption on the federal level because it was definitely there too. So for most of the 19th century, the spoils system was in effect. If you remember that back from American One, Andrew Jackson started it in the 1820s. It was basically this practice of giving government jobs to your supporters and people in your political party rather than people who were actually qualified for the job. And so this just opens the door for ineffectiveness in the government as well as more corruption. So by the 1880s, government corruption is definitely something that political parties are trying to kind of put on their platform, saying like we're against corruption, we're going to end the spoil system. It causes our government to be corrupt and ineffective and slow, so we need to end it. And so in 1880, President Garfield was elected. He ran on an anti-corruption platform, and when he became president, he tried to phase out the spoil system. So there was this man who was looking for a job. His name was Charles Guiteau, and he was probably suffering from some psychological disorders as well. But he believed that he should be I think it was the minister to France. And so he went to the White House to speak to Garfield and asked Garfield to be the minister to France. And Garfield said nope. And then Guiteau eventually ended up assassinating Garfield. And so you can see him down here, in office or your life. But he ends up assassinating Garfield, and his vice president, Arthur, becomes president. And Arthur and Congress work together to pass the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which essentially ends the spoils system and created a civil service exam to test job applicants' qualification for the job they were applying for. So this is, kind of today why like you need a resume to apply for a job. Like you have to put down why you're qualified for jobs rather than, just being hired based on who you know. That way specifically, in the government, it makes the government run more effectively and also tries to limit corruption and, political power for personal gain.